Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Floral Endowment's Grow Pro webinar series. I'm your moderator, Olivia Liebing, and I am a current graduate student at The Ohio State University studying the propagation of ornamental woody nursery crops. Today's session is on rooted in plastics, plastic use, regulations, and alternatives for floriculture container production. On behalf of the endowment, I'm excited to be a part of AFE's Grow Pro webinar series that features a new topic every month presented by an industry expert. The webinars are free to everyone thanks to the generous support of AFE sponsors. The views and opinions expressed in these webinars are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of AFE. As an independent nonprofit, AFE cannot endorse any specific product or opinion. Today's webinar is sponsored by Produce News. The Produce News has been covering fresh produce around the globe since 1897. If you'd like to learn more about our sponsors or are interested in becoming a sponsor for a topic, you can find that information on AFE's website at endowment.org/growpro. Today's session was pre-recorded in English by Dr. Paul Bartley. After the presentation, he will join us for a Q&A. Feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A feature or chat at any time. We'll answer as many as we can before the end of the hour. Unanswered questions may be answered through a separate email exchange. This session is being recorded and will be shared to AFE's YouTube account. Through YouTube's accessibility features, you can access closed captions in other languages. To get us started, I'd like to share a bit about today's expert speaker. Dr. Paul Bartley is an assistant professor in the Department of Horticulture at Auburn University, specializing in landscape environmental stewardship. With a focus on sustainability, he has developed research programs designed to help the horticultural and landscape industries adapt to disruptive policy changes. These initiatives address critical regulatory challenges, including bans and restrictions on landscape equipment, as well as plastic regulations and extended producer responsibility laws. His research focuses on providing practical solutions to ensure industry resilience and sustainability while minimizing environmental impact. Dr. Bartley, welcome and thank you for presenting today on plastic use, regulations, and alternatives for floriculture container production.
Thanks so much for that introduction. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Laura, the American Floral Endowment, for giving me this opportunity to speak on what really is a passion project of mine on plastic use and container production. And specifically in this presentation, we're going to focus more on the floricultural aspects of that. This project is really a group project that I would like to point out and recognize several individuals first. Normally, the acknowledgements go last, but I think in this instance, these people belong at the beginning of the presentation. This is part of a larger multidisciplinary project led by Sushil Adhikari in Biosystems Engineering and Soledad Parisian in our Forestry, Wildlife, and the Environment College, as well as several other biosystems engineering professors, Hassan and Hussein. The title of this grant was the production of horticultural plant containers using biochar from downed timber, and it was funded by the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. Really grateful for the opportunity to do this kind of work through somewhat unconventional pathways to investigate what I think is one of the more pressing concerns in container production. Two other people I would like to recognize are the unsung heroes, the graduate students that really are the muscle and the brains behind a lot of the data collection and interpretation of our results. On the left is Melanie Hill. She's a master's student of mine in her last semester. Phenomenal. And Landon Erbrick, a former AFE scholarship recipient, amazing student that I spent years recruiting. I will shed many tears when they soon graduate in the next few months. They've been phenomenal in assisting with this project. The theme really, as I've kind of thought and developed this, is rooted in plastics. Plastics are really the silent infrastructure of modern floriculture. They hold, ship, display, and protect nearly every plant that we produce. Our industry's dependence on plastics has fueled that growth and efficiency that we are currently experiencing. But with increasing global scrutiny on plastic waste, what was once an unquestioned advantage is now a growing liability. But understanding several aspects, like where we are, what policies are emerging, and how we can innovate isn't just important, it's really essential for our future competitiveness. So let's start off with our current use. If we don't measure it, we can't manage it, right? And that was really our first objective as we began to or launched into this investigation on plastic use in our industry. It wasn't really until recently that we've had these rough estimates that I'm sharing with you now. And we tried several different ways to collect this kind of data, consulting with grower groups or plastic producers, container producers. What really was the best option for us that we found was through the USDA Census for Horticultural Specialties. These are publications produced by the USDA roughly every 5 years. We were expecting one this year, but it has been delayed until December. And in each of these publications, they use data from 2 years prior survey. So the publication in 2009 is going to have data from 2007 and so on. What they do is they report the total units sold per specialty crop sector and the total units sold per container size range. Just a little bit of what that might look like. So here at the bottom is a snippet from a floriculture sector called potted flowering plants sold for indoor or patio use. And this is from the 2019 survey. And in this, you'll see various components, which I'll highlight for you. We're looking at all sales, so total units sold within this sector, as well as pots less than 5 inches. It doesn't specify what size those are, so we do have to make some assumptions here to calculate the amount of plastic consumed per unit. Here, we're assuming that they're 4-inch diameter containers. And then we have pots 5 inches or more. So we assume those to be 6 inches in diameter. We also have to make some assumptions as to what kind of containers they are. Are they injection molded, thermoformed, blow molded? All of those have different weights of plastic per unit, depending on the tooling that was used to create the containers. And then we take the average weight of representative containers within those specified characteristics to determine how much plastic was consumed per unit sold. So not only did we make some assumptions as to what kinds of plastic and containers were per unit reported in this USDA census, but we also made some assumptions as to how much was actually sold. So we assumed that 20% of the crops were not actually sold, but they were lost at some point. That might be high, that might be low for some people, but nonetheless, we settled on 20%. We also calculated the average weight of those containers and then took that by the inflated units sold to calculate the number or weight of pounds in terms of grams, the weight of plastic per unit container. That then, if we convert it to freedom units and pounds from scientific units and grams, will give us our rough estimate as to the amount of plastic consumed within that particular sector or category that is reported in this USDA census. So we did this for many different floriculture sectors that we felt were appropriate. Some were not. Things like annual bedding and garden plants sold as flats, annual bedding plants, garden plants sold as pots, foliage plants for indoor patio use as pots, and also hanging baskets, as well as the numbers reported for plug seedlings. We look at the total units sold in each of these sectors so that we could analyze any trends that might become apparent as we look at 10 years worth of data. We were not particularly concerned about the change in units sold per census, but really just to see if there were any anomalies between our data. The amount of plastic consumed in each sector did vary considerably, but from year to year, or at least from census to census, there was a pretty consistent increase in the amount of plastic from our estimates that the floriculture industry produces or consumes each year. This is dominated by plug seedlings. If we look at the last row of all of those numbers, which accounts for a little more than half of all the plastic consumed. And that's because there are two different components to plug seedlings, right? Or young plant production. Particularly with plugs, you've got the tray and the flat. And the trays are very heavy. They're roughly a pound because they have to support a lot of weight, typically comprised of polypropylene or polystyrene. That's going to become important later as we talk about legislation. The other most weighty, or the other sector with the most weight, were our foliage plants for indoor use and our potted flowering plants for patio use. These use more injection molded containers. So if you look at the most plastic per unit, that would actually come from the foliage plants for indoor patio use, which is assumed to be a 14-inch, pretty ornate container. They're very heavy, and they're meant to last uh, longer than what most people keep a plant alive. We also did this with the nursery sector. So just to briefly go over some of these, there are different sectors for the nursery that are reported compared to the floriculture sector, but the methodology is pretty similar. And when I said it's good to look at this data for any kind of anomalies, this is really what we're talking about. If we look at coniferous evergreens, which we're making an assumption that these are roughly 3-gallon containers, there were almost 300 million units sold in 2009, but then these numbers dramatically dropped to 72 million, which is a 75% decrease. And if you look at the kinds of plants that are reported in the 2009 census that may have contributed to this inflation in numbers, the vast majority of them, 80 to 90 million units, are pine trees. And then others are things like spruce or fir. So really forestry species, right? It's my guess that these are actually seedling nurseries rather than ornamental nurseries, or ornamental nurseries that shortly after the economic collapse in 2009 started probably contract growing some of these. I would love to have some answers from anybody with some history or context that could help inform that, but they certainly seem to be an anomaly because that trend didn't continue even into 2019. So while we do have some anomalies in the amount of plastic that we have attributed to each sector in their nursery production, the numbers were still fairly consistent. We did have a 2.8% increase from 2009 to 2014. 2014 was also a great year for floriculture, and a decrease in many categories for total units sold from 2014 to 2019. And in the nursery sector, this contributed to a decrease in the amount of plastic produced. Similarly to floriculture, though, but actually magnified because the weight, the sturdiness, the size of the young plant production flats and trays, in this case, we estimated that they were 50-count trays. Plastic consumption is huge in liner production, far exceeds any other individual sector. So young plant production, specifically within these two sectors, has been highlighted through this investigation. It is definitely contributing to the most plastic. Just some fun. We wanted to compare floriculture and nursery industries and whether floriculture or nursery contributed more to plastic consumption, because you've got nursery containers that are large, liners that are much bigger. Surely it's got to tolerate environmental pressures and conditions that are less favorable than a greenhouse. So nursery's got to contribute more. Well, actually, floriculture here is in tan, nursery is in green. It's roughly a coin flip, 50-50. Everybody splits it evenly and to the amount of plastic consumed. On average, though, across these three different census, we can estimate that nearly 1,840,000 tons on average, 840,000 tons on average, are consumed in our plant production systems for containers per year. This really brings up a category, or at least a new phrase, embedded plastic liability. It's been a new term to me that I've read recently, but really these materials represent potential future regulatory costs or compliance risks. So every container that we produce today or use today could become tomorrow's regulated waste stream. And that's what makes the second category, regulatory pressure, really important to consider. Plastic policy isn't just coming, it's already here. And it's here because of the amount of plastic that you see in the news. You don't have to look very far to see headlines like these: microplastics, nanoplastics in various organs, um, or your blood systems in different foods, certainly coming out of sea turtles' noses, which has over 200 million views in the several channels that have posted or reposted this video, and it's only 9 years old. So when the public is concerned or there's an outcry for a specific abomination in the public's eyes, generally legislation follows. And that's exactly what's happened. The regulatory landscape in the US is fragmented, but it is accelerating rapidly. Just in the last year or two, we've had a couple of states pass legislation: California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Minnesota, Maine, and Maryland, with some various form of extended producer responsibility, or EPR, laws. And I'll talk about that a little more. There are other laws that talk about marketing of recyclability, or the percent recycled content that is going to be mandated in certain plastics. I'm not going to talk specifically about those. The other states that are on the map are those that have bills that are currently being discussed, either in the state House or Senate, but have not passed yet. Some of them have been discussed for many years. So this is a growing trend. It's accelerating, certainly. Just to describe what EPR, if you're unfamiliar with that, extended producer responsibility, is, it's a policy that holds producers responsible for product management through the product's lifestyle. Essentially, the goal of these EPR laws is to promote sustainable design or to create an economy for the product's end of life stage. So it's a tax. The responsibility of that tax is up for debate. Should the consumers pay for it? Should the producers of the plants pay for it? Should the suppliers of the materials, the manufacturers of the containers, be responsible for this tax? But essentially, the goal is to tax this product, which your plants are going to be labeled as single-use plastic products, and create an economy for these so that the handling of the materials, the shipping costs, the recovery costs, the sorting costs, and ultimately the recycling of those materials can be paid for, because currently the economy is bust when it comes to recycling plastics. So these EPR laws are to force that. Now, I don't speak legalese, so wherever you are in the country, whatever state you live in, and if you're alarmed by one of those red or pink states that I had on the previous map, I completely understand. But I don't speak legalese, and I don't pretend to know all of the legislation that's out there and how it applies to everyone. So I do encourage you right now to please consult with a legal professional that could help explain those laws and what your potential risk and liabilities might be. I'd also like to point out that the American Hort has, in my opinion, done a great job at being on the forefront of this and understanding what kind of bills and laws are out there, because they vary so widely. And here's two examples. I've pulled Oregon and Colorado. Oregon, if you look at their EPR legislation, so they're going to tax the waste stream or waste goods by different categories, and they're going to assign that tax on a weight base of that product. So we've got paper and fiber, rigid plastic, and flexible plastic. Well, which ones do your containers fit into? Well, the best definition from my reading of Oregon's bill is that they're going to be rigid plastics. The containers are going to hold their shape regardless of whether they're filled or not. Colorado has different legislation, different laws that are going to tax the type of plastic, not just categorize them by rigid or flexible plastics, but are going to be specific as to the type of petroleum that's used. This PET bottles, those are water bottles, for example. Plastic bags and films are going to have their own category, and polystyrene containers, which we do produce in large quantities for horticultural use, were the highest taxed. So if we were to apply some of these individual laws to the nationwide survey that we have just looked at, and the assumptions that we made for our industry's plastic consumption over the last decade or more, and apply those at the low end to the high end, we're looking at a regulatory risk somewhere of 400 to almost $600 million. And while this is theoretical, because these laws are only applied to the individual states in which they're passed, it's not entirely theoretical. I don't think anybody had regulation on peat coming from Canada on their bingo cards this year. So we've seen, very unbelievable circumstances come to pass that influence and affect our industry very quickly and substantially. And I think this could be another one of those, particularly if you're located in one of those states, and depending on how that state implements a plastic tax or any other kind of regulatory legislation. So depending on how these laws are implemented, we're looking at substantial regulatory costs that could amount to millions across the industry. Where are some of our vulnerabilities, or at least, insights that through conversations with others and some of our investigations that I could kind of point out at this time with my current understanding of the industry and containers at this time, and some legislation. Some of the difficulties that we're going to run into are with mixed plastic containers. All of our branded containers, they're using multiple films. Any colored or dyed plastic is going to use virgin plastic. The virgin plastic is not going to have any recycled content in there. And it could also potentially have some complications in the recyclability of those materials, as streams of from recycled plants that are pulling and sorting products are sorting and pulling various plastic into different categories. There are different plastics used. It creates a very convoluted mess. Injection molded containers for sure are the greatest amount of plastic per unit. Thermoform is by far the most efficient, even more efficient than blow molded containers. Blow molded is vastly improved from injection molded. So if you're trying to reduce your plastic consumption, there are different tools that allow us to use different types of plastic and less plastic per unit. Propagation and liner production by far is the largest culprit in our industry for plastic consumption, or let's just say sector in our industry for plastic consumption, because of the things that I've already described. But really the volatility and the mandates in and of themselves create vulnerabilities within our industry, because there's a lot of confusion as to who these are applied to, who is exempt from these things, at what stage are these exempt, and they're not all of these mandates are regulated equally, or enforced equally. So let's just say New Jersey, for example, has a 10% post-consumer responsibility or post-consumer recycled content law, rising to 50%. Well, education would be really important as to when that increase is going to occur on an annual basis, biannual basis, or et cetera. So our industry has really benefited from an efficient system that was built for different environmental assumptions than what we face today. So we must balance that environmental responsibility with horticultural performance and also economic viability, which is really challenging. So let's look at some of the innovative solutions. But really first, some of the containers that are commercially available out there, just to kind of benchmark what is currently produced, right? And we do that on a small scale here at Auburn University, looking at different biodegradable or bio-based containers, plastic alternative containers, if you will, and various production systems. We'll look at them on an 8-week interval, and we'll pull and destructively harvest containers on a 2-week interval. Because let's say a container did not last after 8 weeks, but it was perfectly fine and suitable from 0 to 4 weeks. We'd like to evaluate and note that. I will note right now that not all of these containers are currently being used or showcased in the manner in which they are intended to be used. Some of them are specific for propagation, but we're really looking at these containers from a material characterization standpoint, not whether a container manufacturer is producing a viable container for production or not. We're not passing that judgment. We're just looking at materials, okay? We also look at things through this process like container water loss. Surprise, surprise. These containers with semi-permeable membranes lose a lot of water as opposed to some of our biopolymers and plastics. We do things like mechanical tests on tensile instruments, looking at tensile strength and breakage, more on that. We look at that in dry and wet conditions because the characteristics of the materials can change drastically, like you saw in that starch video, depending on the moisture content. We'll look at things like microbial degradation on biopolymer versus plastic, looking at things like mycelium, as you would see on the interior of the biopolymer containers in week 8. And of course, we do growth assays. While most studies have kind of concluded unanimously that a lot of these biodegradable or bio-based options grow great plants, we have seen some instances where there are differences that are not just attributed to volumes, but some of these materials do have, let's say, some phytotoxic components to them. Let's talk a little bit about mechanical properties real quick and introduce you some of the metrics that we use to evaluate these containers at each of these time intervals that we test. Things like force at max load, tensile strength, modulus of elasticity, and elongation at break. Specifically, we're just going to look at 2 of them real quick to help demonstrate some of the disparity between some of our bio-based or biodegradable containers and the current plastic containers that you use. Let's look at force at max load quickly. So the magic number here is 40. That's approximately 9 pounds of force. And you'll see plastic down at the bottom in both dry and wet conditions far exceeds the magic number of 40, as well as the biopolymer containers, which actually exceed the force at max load of plastic containers. They're very strong containers. But if you look at the right, I'm showing you a cross-sectional image of our various materials. The green there is our biopolymer that we test, and the black on the far left, which is almost a shadow, is the polypropylene container. So these do vary by container thickness. Some of the materials, regardless of how thick they are, really never, let's look at the manure containers, for example, never come close to the strength that would be required for production. And these change pretty dramatically from when they're dry and when they're wet. Let's look at the starch containers, for example. Dry, 76 newtons, and at week 4, 49 newtons were still good, but when wet, even a unused material was unable to be tested because it just turned to gelatin. So there is a huge disparity between these biodegradable materials, but also some similarities between our biopolymers and our plastics. These similarities, though, come and go. And so elongation at break, we're all used to the ductility of plastic containers, the ability to squeeze them and them not break or crack. They're not fragile at all, yet plastic here in this example far exceeds that of biopolymers, with elongation at break at 46% to 25%, and the rest of our materials are roughly 10 or less. So these materials are much more likely to break upon contact or shatter if bent beyond its ability to retain its shape. We look at things like student surveys, and the students love these. They love to see the new containers come in to evaluate them. If there are any plant differences in the containers, we remove the plants just to prevent bias, but we ask them, what do you think about these containers? What is your likeliness to purchase a plant that is produced in a container of this age or this type? And we get all kinds of fun responses like, ooh, I love this container. It looks like I'm growing in a bird's nest. Or this container looks like you just microwaved a styrofoam cup. We get all kinds of hilarious comments and feedback from this. But what is generally understood is that our biopolymers and some of our unique biodegradable or bio-based materials spec very well to a consumer audience. And our audience in this case would range from college age to, we evaluated 50, 60-year-olds as well, anybody on campus. So we get a lot of good feedback from them. Very often do we see very consistent feedback, regardless of the age or really the appearance of the container. And a lot of people do prefer those that are bio-based or biodegradable. We did not advertise or talk about that. Now, there are some plastic trade-offs, and this is something that I'm very appreciative of some people within the industry that have taught me, and something that we've learned through our investigations as well. There are really four key things that we're looking for with any kind of alternative material to replace our petroleum-based plastics. It has to be, number one, processable. It has to survive production. It has to have a desirable end of life and be economical. And it's really rare, and it really in that order as well. It's really rare that we evaluate materials that are a turnkey product for alternatives for petroleum-based plastics. Alternatives are typically more difficult to produce with current tooling. And if you walk through a floor of, let's say, HC containers or Creo or East Jordan plastics, it is incredible, the tooling and the systems and the production that is going on that floor. To say, oh, they should just replace their tooling and make these new containers, I think is a foolish and naive statement, especially when you can see it being produced at that scale. The manufacturers are incredible. Surviving production, that's kind of what we look at. And we do see a canyon between a lot of our biodegradable and bio-based materials and plastic. I also think there's a lot of opportunity then, because there is such a disparity between the performances and the metrics or characteristics between those two containers. We don't really need one that is plastic. We just need one that's closer to plastic. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for innovation. Desirable end of life is really about public education. I've learned so much about what plastic is, how plastic is produced, the difference between PP and PE and HDPE, right? There are so many different types of plastic, and all of those have different life cycle analysis and inputs into them, even the biodegradable polymers like PLA, PVA, PBA. There are so many different materials out there. The key is education, as I think this is going to be a learning curve, not only for the suppliers of these containers, the producers of the containers, and the end consumers, but it's going to be across the board that we're all going to learn how to adapt to these new materials when and hopefully if they come along. And economical. The cost per unit for alternatives is much higher currently than petroleum-based plastics. It's such a well-established industry, the oil manufacturing industry or refinement industry. Currently, we just don't have plug-and-play replacements for plastic containers. So we need to innovate on all fronts, on the material side and on the system side. I want at this time to point out that adaptation really isn't optional. The question is whether or not we'll be reactive or proactive is the question that I pose, but I'm most confident and excited about our industry's ability to innovate and respond because I get to talk to and learn from manufacturers like AirTrays and Lars, which really they think untraditionally outside of the box, and they've invested in products that create closed loops for plastic consumption so that these air trays stay on site and that there can be alternative packaging for direct sale. Yes, potentially different machinery would be used, but it is, I think, a great solution to this problem under the right circumstances. HC Company and their low profile trays, I've talked a lot about in this presentation, how much young plant production and specifically trays can inflate the amount of plastic that we consume as an industry. These are a great innovative solution to this, using less resin with higher recyclability because they're made from polypropylene rather than polystyrene. Then we've got the Creo Group, formerly Nursery Supplies Inc., and they're a silly pot. Early metrics from these containers are really good. We're still putting them through the paces, but they're accelerating innovation and partnerships with material science and packaging. And the launch of this silly pot is exciting for sure. And then East Jordan Plastics, really leading the way in recycling tens and millions of pounds of containers per year, and then opening a new plant in Lyons, Georgia, which is roughly 4 hours away, a little too far away for me, but I can't wait to tour it as soon as I'm capable, and learn more about the recycling of these containers. It's really a whole phase industry response to these, and I'm constantly impressed with the innovation that our industry demonstrates. Just kind of in closing, every time I talk about this topic, I think about two quotes, and I am going to leave them anonymous just because I don't know if this person really wants to be associated with these lines. I'm proud of them for saying it. But one producer said, "We grow the world's most beautiful gift wrapped in trash." And if that doesn't cause you to reflect, another one said, and I paraphrased here just a little bit, that container production allows us to grow, move, and deliver plants that provide immense environmental, aesthetic, and economic benefits. And the tools that we use, plastic containers, to enable us to produce these plants should not detract from that value, right? So the benefits that we provide should not be minimized by how we produce them. I think that's a great thing to reflect on, and certainly something to consider as we think about improving our industry's sustainability and marketability moving forward. And to go back to our roots, rooted in plastics, our current plastic dependence runs deep, right? It's what's allowed us to grow the greatest innovation, I think, in our industry. Brian Jackson might argue it's wood substrates, it's to be determined. But now we're facing increasing external pressures that really threaten to destabilize these roots, right? And our future resilience really depends on how successfully we can grow new roots and innovate and find products and methods that are both economically viable as well as environmentally responsible. And those that adapt rather than react, I think are going to thrive in the next iteration or era of our industry as we move towards these changes. I want to thank for a moment here again AFE for allowing me to come and produce, and the sponsor, of course, the Produce News. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity for so many in the industry, HRI, American Hort, Tom Marting, Amy Drew, Wayne Hinton. Y'all have all been instrumental in partnering with me and educating me. I have a saying, I'm only as smart as the people I know, and I am extremely blessed to have some very wonderful, knowledgeable, and caring individuals to partner along with us in this process. And so thank you again for the opportunity, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that y'all have.
Paul, thank you for your presentation. Before we open up the Q&A, I'd like to encourage you all to join us next month for Dr. Christian Nansen's presentation on plasma activated water for floriculture production. That webinar will take place on Tuesday, July 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can register at endowment.org/growpro or click the link in the chat. So now I'd like to open up the session for Q&A. So Ben says, I really appreciate how clearly you laid out the processing challenges for alternative containers. Given that some sustainable materials are not compatible with existing tooling, do you see industry shifting towards retooling infrastructure, or is the focus more on adapting materials to fit existing systems?
Thanks, Ben. I have I have at least what I tell all of my students anyway in class is I've got one rule, and it's not to ask me any questions I don't know the answers to. And you right off the bat started breaking my one rule. But that's a really insightful question, and one that I think I'm probably not prepared to answer because I don't produce containers, and different organizations have different, let's say, objectives for how they're going to approach or meet some of these challenges. I think from the ones that I have talked to, the desire is to adapt the materials to the current tooling that they're using, um, and and they will reject or shelve any other materials that do not work suitably with their current tooling. So it is really challenging. You think about their current efforts right now to produce plastic products are going 100 miles an hour. You know, their maximum capacity to produce containers. To adjust any of the tooling to accommodate a different material takes time. And changing out that tooling, changing out the plastic or some of the polymers is just money that they're losing. So if there's an opportunity to use their current tooling while this transition is occurring, or if plastics continue to be around, maybe we're just getting better at recycling them. You know, I think that is the approach that many of them are taking. But that I've only talked to a few.
All right, Megan asks, if possible, can you share what the biopolymer was that you tested in trials?
Um, I don't want to share because I didn't ask permission before doing so, and I'm sorry that's a cop-out answer, but one thing I want to avoid is either promoting or saying anything disparaging about a particular product or company. So I wouldn't like to reveal that. We have tested a handful of biopolymers at this point, and they're really impressive. We've even created some now with biochar. So trying to create a container that's possibly carbon neutral or carbon positive, carbon negative is the goal, and we're really looking forward to some of those.
Craig has a question. Did any of your testing include molded fiber nursery containers? Containers made from recycled paper.
We do have we have evaluated some molded fiber containers on a nursery pad. It was a replicated study in Auburn and in Mobile, and I really like the containers. They did not hold up for a full 12 months. The bottoms of the containers were compromised by the end of our 1 year trial. But they did a great job for 6, 7, 8 months. Really great, sturdy containers. The walls were still good, but they got very thin and waterlogged and lost their integrity at the bottom of the containers.
Okay. And can you explain again the impact of branded colored pots on the recycling process?
So my understanding of it, and that's a great question, is these are multi-layered plastics. So they're going to take plastic films and layer them so that the outside layer is the virgin plastic. Virgin plastic is clear or whitish in color. So that's the best foundation to then, inject any kind of colorant to make the branded container, whether that's a white for proven winners or a purple for first editions. It's a great base to create a marketed container. So those are multi-layered containers. So some of the layers can have recycled content then because they're black, and typically it's a colored on a black. And but the colored containers are going to use virgin plastic, so there's no recycled content in those. There's a lot of debate on whether or not different colored containers will be sorted appropriately, or should we standardize container colors or sizes? to make sure that on the recycling end, that those are sorted and reused. And I just can't confirm. There's too many contradicting statements from recyclers that I've talked to, and other companies that I've spoken with to say whether or not that really makes a difference on recyclability. But for sure, any branded container is going to, that's not black, is going to use virgin plastic.
Okay, next, do the biopolymers impact disease presence?
Do the biopolymers impact disease presence? Um, if there's a particular angle that they're looking at, you know, could they specify a little bit
They're
more?
saying, thinking of the mycelial photos you showed.
Oh, okay. No, we have not seen any increase in disease prevalence in biocontainers, positively or negatively compared to plastics. They function, look, and feel extremely similar. The biopolymers that we've tested over an 8-week trial, they lose roughly 10% of their weight very quickly, but then they stabilize pretty well. We haven't tested them in a nursery environment yet. I take that back. We did test one biopolymer. It did really well in a nursery environment. Some of the biopolymers actually absorb a little bit of water, and so they can lose their shape and warp a little bit, which can affect their ability to remain upright. And so that could be a big challenge on a nursery pad. But short term in a floriculture crop, they've been great.
Okay, and do you think microplastics leach into horticultural products?
Okay. Um, Leach into horticultural products. So like if we're growing basil, is the basil taking up microplastics and then we're eating it? Is that maybe the direction of the question? I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question and certainly one of concern, I'm sure.
And here's another question from Ben. Are there plans to test these containers under more dynamic nursery conditions, like freeze thaw, UV exposure, or irrigation cycles to simulate real-world stress and aging more comprehensively?
There are machines to simulate um, environmental stresses on them. They use them mostly on short-term tests to look at ink for labeling on containers. And so they're going to simulate UV conditions, humidity, things like that. We have not used those machines. Those have been offered to us and made available, but that does allow us to have consistent and repeatable testing under set parameters that might simulate some of the conditions on a nursery pad. What the conditions on a nursery pad that we're not simulating are temperatures. And we know that those can fluctuate widely, 140, 150 degrees externally. Um, and that's going to change from the bottom of the container to the sides of the containers and the orientation of the containers. So we don't have a full understanding yet. I don't have a full understanding yet of how those conditions affect nursery grade alternatives to plastics at this time. But there are opportunities to do that in a controlled setting, as well as the chaotic nursery pad setting.
Tony has a question. Are there any ASTM standards for plastic pots?
ASTM standards for what? Degradation or material testing? There's a lot of standards out there. So what aspect specifically might we be testing for? Would be important to know. There are a lot of ASTM standards, and I still think there's room for more. And some of our evaluations, there are not standards, let's say, for biodegradable or bio-based. So we are adopting plastic standards and making many assumptions in doing so that these materials should act similarly. Let's take a fiber container, for example. As soon as we cut these standard, they call them coupons, for tensile testing. We're disrupting that fibrous matrix, um, and potentially compromising the integrity, or maybe not reflecting the true strength of that container wall when we do that. So some things we do need to use our intuition a little bit and say this material is fit for this standard or not, and adapt as needed. We're just trying to do our best in communicating how we've adapted standards when we do test materials.
Okay, and then I have a question as more getting put in the chat or QA. How do you think consumer perception, especially around sustainability claims, is influencing both policy and purchasing behavior in container production?
Since COVID, at least, which might be when my radar started, being receptive of these issues on sustainability, I think the general public became very aware of the impact of their purchasing decisions, the end of life cycle of the products that they consume on a daily basis, and whether they are sustainable or not. There have been many publications on whether on the increased awareness of sustainability efforts or mindfulness of the environmental impact of your average consumer, from various industries, including horticulture. So I also work in the landscape industry, primarily, actually, and there are a shocking number of similarities in public perception following, or um, uh, generally occurring prior to legislation being passed at state levels, or changes in public perception, followed by policy changes at the state level or community level. And so I just see a lot of mirroring in this situation, where you have a general audience that all of a sudden um, characterizes a activity or a product as unsustainable, or they desire an alternative, and policy then follows that. So the implementation of those policies has been the biggest struggle. I think everybody wants to do and promote something that is better, and but how we're going about that seems to be very shaky, and there's a lot of different opinions on how to implement those, how to regulate those. So it's a big challenge for sure.
So where do you see the biggest research or technology gaps that need to be addressed for alternative containers to become commercially viable at scale?
Yeah, so some of the big challenges that I pointed out have to do with the material characteristics and how well they can fit in with current tooling, and just to describe some of the challenges that we've got with bio-based materials. It can be as simple as the weight of the polymer. So polypropylene or polyethylene is going to have a specific density of 0.9, and that allows it to float. Water has a specific density of 1. So that's why we have a lot of plastic pollution floating around in the Pacific, right? So these are low density materials, and manufacturers purchase these raw materials based on weight. And our biopolymers weigh not 0.9, but 1.2 to 1.3. So right off the bat, they are 30 to 50% more expensive on a per weight basis or per volume basis than our raw materials. So the economics really don't favor a lot of these biopolymers just from that aspect alone. And so there are a lot of challenges with that. But then what other materials, let's say waste streams, that we can recycle and repurpose with some of these other polymers to create a product with a lower carbon footprint, or a product that is potentially carbon neutral or carbon negative, like our biochar containers. Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunities, but right now the tooling is probably the biggest concern, and then the price right now for just raw materials, but some of that is scalability. And so we need a lot of people that are willing to take that leap into biodegradable containers or more sustainable containers and pioneer that effort. But it certainly needs to make sense for them.
If anyone else has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or QA.
And I love the link to the consumer perceptions on willingness to pay. That's great. Oh, I also wanted to plug, could I? The Sustainablooms got a plastic section, and it looks like Belinda Knuth and a couple other people have put together some really great educational documentation on plastic guides for floriculture industry growers or retailers. There's some really great information, and it is beautifully produced. I mean, the colors are great. The content is wonderful. I was looking at those this morning. 10 out of 10 job on those. I highly recommend that site and those articles specifically.
All right then. Well, thank you for joining us today for another session of AFE's Grow Pro webinar series. Join us next month for Dr. Christian Nansen's presentation on plasma activated water for floriculture production on Tuesday, July 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Register ahead at endowment.org/growpro. While there, check out our past webinar recordings, other grower-related resources, and research reports available to you free, thanks to industry support. If you find this webinar series and AFE's other industry resources valuable, please consider making a donation to AFE's 2025 annual fundraising campaign. This campaign is less than 1 week left, and every contribution helps ensure a bright and successful future for the floriculture industry. More information about this year's campaign and sponsorship information can be found at endowment.org/rise. We ask that you please complete the brief survey about today's sessions, while you can suggest additional topics and help us continue to improve these webinars.